Hi, everybody. Martin Straathof here. I'm really sorry that I can't be there to give this presentation in person. I think the initiative that the Stratford Affordable Housing Alliance is doing around community land trusts is just fantastic. And so without further ado, I'm going to jump right into my presentation. So again, my name is Martin Straathof. I'm the Executive Director of the Ontario Farmland Trust. And I'm talking about this topic of Agrihoods because I completed my MSc in Rural Planning and Development at the University of Guelph, where I researched Agrihoods for their impact as a potential model for development-supported agriculture. For those who might not be familiar with the Ontario Farmland Trust, our organization is the only province-wide land trust, so a conservation organization, with a mission dedicated to the protection of farmland. And at OFT, when we're talking about farmland, it's important to know that we mean the agricultural, natural, and cultural features that together form our food-producing landscapes. We're not only trying to protect farmland, though, but address the dynamic challenges that contribute to the conditions that lead to farmland loss in our province. And that's so important because Ontario's farmland is finite, it's obviously limited, and provides a wide range of services to our communities, including food production, economic development, ecosystem services, and social benefits. Despite that, we are losing 319 acres of farmland per day to many reasons, including urban sprawl and land use planning policies that are prioritizing aggregate extraction over maintaining our food producing landscapes and our prime farmland. So yes, there is a housing availability and affordability crisis, and that's not just within our rural or sorry, I should say that's not just within our urban boundaries. Our rural communities and the agricultural sector are experiencing the impacts of this crisis as well. And we're seeing a strong push for housing development, but I think the rural estate lot McMansions that we're seeing being developed right now is not going to contribute significantly, especially anytime soon, to housing stock or affordability. And instead of putting these two basic necessities at odds of one another, which is being, our basic necessities of food and shelter, we should be finding a way to create a model of housing development that balances this need for food production, especially since we're seeing farmland prices in Ontario skyrocket by 22%, 19%, and 11% increases year over year since 2021. This is making it incredibly difficult for new and young farmers to get into agriculture, let alone make it a viable career choice or even a lifestyle. And yet 40% of farmers are going to retire within the next 10 years, and 66% don't have a succession plan. And on top of that, agriculture can be very isolating. And that leads to farmers experiencing increased stress levels and mental health challenges. So all of this is really becoming a recipe for disaster that will have long-term impacts on our agricultural sector, our rural communities, and then, of course, more broadly, our province as well. So the thought is, what if instead of putting these land uses at odds of one another, we look at models that create more of a symbiotic relationship between community development and food production? So this is where Agrihoods come in. Let's start with trying to define what an agrihood is. First, definitions can be all over the map, but in the research that I conducted, we considered an agrihood as a master planned community that integrates residential living with agriculture. Now, that's a pretty basic definition that doesn't give a lot to go off of when it comes to achieving the plethora of benefits that are touted by agrihood developers. But more holistically, to add to this definition, it's not just about placing homes next to farms. It's about integrating these spaces to create a sustainable environment where community and agriculture can enhance one another, which requires the developers, at least currently right now, because we don't have planning policies to support this otherwise. So it requires the developers to be very intentional in their design, And I mean intentional to achieve these lists of benefits that you'll see out there about Agrihoods. And this concept of this intentional and value-based community development that incorporates agriculture actually aligns quite nicely, I think, with the Ontario Farmland Trust vision, because it creates a community that inherently values farmland, has a high value that they place on farmland. And I don't just mean financial value, I mean the intrinsic value of what that land does for our community. There's also a number of key characteristics, but they can be all over the map as well. Every agrihood is different, from size to location to housing types to the types of food production that takes place. But a few kind of generalized characteristics. First, of course, they're centered around a working farm, or at least have significant agricultural space, which serves as this heart of the community. And I want to say heart as well as identity, right? The farm, it's not only about producing food, but it's also a communal space and a recreational space. It's seen as an amenity for folks living there. Secondly, agriculture can be intentionally used to foster more of a close-knit community atmosphere where residents are actively participating in farming activities. So whether that has to do with planting seeds all the way through to harvest festivals, and they can vary again in scale or level of engagement from community members. But the last thing I want to note from a characteristic side of things, particularly about what's touted about Agrihoods, is that they're meant to be built with sustainability in mind. And sure, that can include things like incorporating green building practices or renewable energy sources. But what's really critical here, I think, is the conservation techniques that are applied in order to minimize the environmental footprint or any loss of farmland. And I talk a lot about that in my thesis as well. So I'll make sure there's a link provided to everybody so you can take a look at that. The third I want to talk about is these potential benefits. So they're vast, really, but again, it requires the intention. So for one, they promote local food production, which reduces food miles and carbon footprints while ensuring fresh produce is also available right where people live, which is obviously great for those folks buying that food, but it can also be really important to the farmer to have like such close proximity to their customers. That makes a huge difference. Agrihoods can also offer alternative and affordable pathways for new and young farmers to get into agriculture. So as farms get bigger and bigger, it will be harder for new farmers to find space to start off small, right? Not everybody either wants to or can't even afford a farm the size of 200 plus acres, even just 100 acres. So through this, we're helping to create pipelines of the next generation of farmers to address that kind of gap that we're seeing. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's one mechanism that we can use as a province to do this. And if the intention is to put into like preserving farmland and preserving green spaces, this model is going to be able to help combat things such as urban sprawl as well. They also offer a community model for living that reconnects people with the food that they eat, obviously being an important factor in food literacy and healthy food choices. It also connects people with each other. And I think that's also a really important factor when it comes to helping address the issue of isolation in agriculture and working in a collaborative, possibly cooperative model. Some of the significant challenges, however, yeah, there's a lot. One major hurdle is the complexity of land use planning. Integrating residential and agriculture zoning requires innovative planning and strong partnerships between the developers and the municipalities. And we have to remember that for decades now, there's been this inherent notion that agriculture and residential land uses are incompatible. So our land use planning policies and frameworks have pretty much said they have to be separate. And now these communities need to be designed within a policy framework that says, no, they are compatible after all. So There's also the challenge of ensuring that these communities are genuinely sustainable and not just marketed as green. Obviously, a practice that we all know is greenwashing. And this is where the ecological benefits are being overstated to pretty much boost their sales. So we need to ensure that Agrihoods truly deliver on their promise of sustainability and community benefits, which requires rigorous planning, clear intentions and goal setting, and ongoing community involvement. The development process, it has to be transparent and inclusive to avoid becoming pretty much just another form of exclusive or high cost housing that fails to serve the broader community. So, as I saw in my research, there were groups of individuals that became the developer of their agrihood. So I called these more collective created agrihoods. And then there were those that were created more by your corporate style professional developers. What was interesting in my research was not only did we see the collective agrihoods have the shortest time frame from land acquisition to construction compared to developer created agrihoods, they had very intentional designs in their community to help preserve the farmland, and their houses tended to be, not just tended to be, they were more affordable than the others. And although out of the examples I'm going to share with you later on that you can find in my thesis, one community that I like to point to a lot is Yarrow Eco Village. They did share that even their farmers did have a hard time affording homes in their community. So despite being more affordable than the developer-driven agrihoods, the cost can still be a barrier. And this is where I think the role of a community land trust can really help ensure that housing affordability, that aspect of it within an agrihood, they have a huge role to play in that. And in collaboration with a conservation land trust, you can ensure that the farmland is protected in perpetuity and offer land access for folks who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. So as I'm just going through this and seeing these actors of being able to take innovative models of community development and community land trusts and conservation land trusts and putting them together, it just seems like this win-win-win potential that's very clear, but like I said, not without its challenges. So this is a lot to squeeze into a few minutes, but a few things about where to go from here if you're thinking about this as something that you'd like to take on. One, more research definitely needs to be done, and everyone's responsible for engaging in their own research as well. And it's great that you're all here starting off learning about this sort of stuff. But of course, the research doesn't have all the answers. In a classic academic fashion, one of my recommendations out of my research was to continue to conduct more research, particularly to get a longitudinal aspect of what these impacts are, but also understanding that what worked for one agrihood won't necessarily work for another. So we need to continue studying the impacts of agrihoods and those impacts that they have on communities and the agricultural system more broadly. And we have to hone in on what actually contributed to those impacts. If you're just starting out and you want to review my thesis, as I said, I am going to be providing a link so folks can be able to access that. And the two Canadian communities in particular that I think folks in this group would really be interested in looking up is the Our Eco Village as well as the Yarrow Eco Village. I think out of the second step, start building your collective. If you have a group of people who are interested in this, start having regular scheduled meetings, whether it's monthly, bi-weekly, quarterly, however you want to do it that works for your schedule, but just make the intention to start meeting to talk about this with your collective. I would really recommend ensuring that you figure out what, as a collective, you want your intention to be for this community. Consider also the ownership and governance framework. This is really important, not only obviously from a legal perspective, but it'll also help you as a collective navigating anything such as disagreements or conflicts. And one sort of model that I advocate for is sociocracy. And there's a lot of great resources out there on how to set up a governance model using sociocracy. And I'll make sure that I share that link as well. I think the last point that I have here, I know Simon Sinek will always say, like, start with the why. And I do think that those first few points is really coming into the why, particularly number 2, when you talk about your intentions. But we can't forget how crucial the how is also going to be in this. How will the project be financed? How will you find the land? How will you make decisions as a group? But the how that I want to focus in on is how are you going to protect the land? Obviously, we're in my farmland trust at this point. I'm going to focus on this because I think this is also where, community land trusts and a farmland trust can really find some synergies together. It could come in the form of the community land trust and farmland trust co-owning the land. It can also, be set up in a way where the residential area is actually severed and the community land trust owns that, and the farmland is severed and the farmland trust owns that. Or the other piece is that the community land trust can own all of the land, and simply the farmland trust can place a conservation easement over the agricultural and natural landscapes that are meant to be protected. So obviously there are several ways of getting this done and getting it structured this way, but planning that how will be so important early on because that will have significant impact when it comes to engaging stakeholders and considering some potential collaboration as well as the financial model of your Agrihood. So before I sign off saying thank you so much for your time, I did want to emphasize that these communities are very complex. And without clear intentions that are integrated into the planning and design of the community, we cannot assume that these benefits will just simply manifest themselves by virtue of calling it an Agrihood. Or if not an Agrihood, a farm-to-table community, however developers want to market them. These have to be really well thought out, and every element really be considered for both the positive and potentially negative impacts. So if you're out there researching Agrihoods, you're going to come across so much about all the benefits that they have, but I encourage you all to be really skeptical. Those benefits, I think, are good potential benefits, but whether or not an Agrihood actually achieves them has to come down to the intention of those who are planning and developing it. And if you do start developing your own Agrihood someday, which is an exciting thought, I encourage you to do your homework and be responsible developers. If you're applying good planning practices, if you're using a community land trust model and partnering with conservation organizations, I think you're going to be off to a really good start. So thank you all again so much for listening. It's a lot to crunch into a short amount of time. And again, sorry I can't be there in person, but I do look forward to receiving any questions and we'll try to get responses back to you all as soon as possible. Thanks again for listening and goodbye, everyone.